Welcome to the Education Innovators Podcast. I'm Eric Byron. This is season 4, and it is my privilege to host this show where I get to talk with thought leaders and experts from all over the world. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Punishments work because of shame and fear. And we know that shame and fear shuts down the parts of our brain that we need for learning, that we need for thinking broadly, that we need for our social ability to connect with other people. And so we're shutting those parts of our children's brains down when we most want those to be opened up.
Punishing bad behavior just makes it worse. I had a fascinating conversation with Doug Bolton. He's the author of Untethered, Creating Connected Families, Schools, and Communities to Build a Resilient Generation. Now, he has over 20 years experience as a clinical psychologist in schools, and he's developed some new thinking about the way we teach and how we can increase engagement, emotional resilience, and improve learning outcomes for all students. Keep listening.
Today I have with me Doug Bolton, and he is a clinical psychologist and director of school consultation for Formative Psychological Services in Chicago. He spent over 20 years as a school psychologist and education leader. Dr. Bolton provides consultation, supervision, and professional development to parents, educators, and clinicians throughout the U.S. to create communities that help foster students and staff resilience. So we'll talk today about his book, Untethered, Creating Connected Families, Schools, and Communities to Raise a Resilient Generation. All right, welcome to the show, Doug.
Eric, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, this is going to be fun, I hope. Your book is
I can't imagine it won't be.
All right, yeah, your book is really interesting. All right, let's do a little icebreaker just to get to know you a little bit better.
Sure.
So, when you were a teenager, Doug, what career did you imagine for yourself?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think I pictured myself as a coach. I think I played a lot of sports, and I think if I go back to there, I would have loved to have been a high school basketball coach. So probably that would have come first, and then I would be teaching so I could be a high school basketball coach.
Oh, interesting. So you're not that far off from where you
Too
thought you'd
far,
be.
no.
Yeah,
The thing that I was right about was I loved being with kids. And
right.
and so that was the part that I found that I think I was imagining loving. And for me, I think it was I loved the game. I had this idea that I loved the game of basketball and wanting to work with kids the way coaches had worked with me. But I feel very lucky to have been able to spend my career working with young people.
A little insightful. That was good. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about Untethered. And I apologize up front. I'm going to start with a brutal oversimplification of what I believe you're attempting to teach us in the book, and then hopefully you can sort us out and explain it
Sure.
much better. Okay? My loose interpretation. You believe that punishment for bad behavior actually makes things worse. We need to build relationships and develop emotional intelligence in children to make them more resilient and less likely to act out. How bad is that?
I
Or good?
love it. I think so here's how I would refine that, let's say.
Okay.
It really begins with I spent my career in therapeutic schools as a school psychologist and then as a principal of a therapeutic school for 14 years. And so I found myself wanting to work with the hardest kids in behaviorally the most challenging kids and loved that work and loved we began to think about them differently. And in schools, therapeutic schools, the way people mostly thought about how do we create change for kids is through getting just the right menu of incentives and punishments, and then that'll do it. And what that does is it relies on this model of behavior as a result of our motivation. And so if we change the motivation, then we'll change the behavior. But I'm not sure about you, but there are times when I lose my temper and I yell at my kids. And I'm not motivated to yell at my kids. I know that it's wrong, and yet here I am doing it. So what we began to realize is that there are things that we were getting that was counterproductive. That I think that what we began learning was we were successful as a school in spite of, not because of this elaborate menu of incentives and punishments. So then how do we understand this? And I wrote the book partly because there became more and more of a crisis of mental health for kids generally, and it was really showing up in schools. And so I was asked to figure out, how do we make sense of this? And so what I realized is that when I think about mental health in kids, I think about three basic factors. The first is their ability to create healthy relationships. I talk about that as attachment in the book. The second is our ability to be emotionally regulated. And typically, that's why we go into therapy for those two things. We need therapeutic support because of those two things. The third is trauma. And the challenge that trauma creates is that when you've experienced trauma, that it's wildly dysregulating and it's really disruptive to our ability to trust in relationships. And there's one thing that actually hits all of those three factors. And the one thing that is consistent in the research that supports the development of our ability to build healthy, strong relationships, our ability to be self regulated, and it also reverses the impact of trauma. And that is being embedded in a connected and regulated community. And I realized that was actually what we did really well. It wasn't this menu of incentives and punishments that was why we were so successful. It was because we built a community that was really connected, and that when kids were dysregulated, we would be able to regulate them through our relationship. And that when kids came in with these histories of trauma, we were able to help quiet their nervous systems enough so that they could fully engage. And so to me, that's what the book is really focused on, is then how do we build these communities, not just in our schools, but in our homes and on our teams as well.
Yeah. No, again, as I was saying earlier, I was fascinated with your book, partly because it really is a major paradigm shift, right? The world is really based around incentives and punishments, right? You get rewarded
Absolutely.
for good behavior, you get punished for bad behavior, you get incentivized for good performance, you get punished for bad performance, that's all of it through school, life, even in marriage sometimes, right?
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
incentives and
Yeah.
punishments in a marriage relationship. So it feels like you're asking a lot to get us to think differently about this stuff.
The thing is that I think we do this stuff, the other piece as well. It's just about what do we emphasize? It's about leaving something out, but I think that we've been successful as a society because we do regulate others well, that we're really good at building relationships with our kids and our students. That's why we have kids, is because we are wanting to connect with them, and that's why people go into the teaching profession.
Right.
It's about getting rid of the thing that gets in the way. And the research on incentives and punishments has been really debunked. It's really debunked this as a main strategy for decades. It's not like this is new information.
Yeah.
The real challenge is that I think that it feeds us in a couple of different ways. When we become dysregulated, we want to begin it helps us to feel in control when we can punish. And so I think we dive into that. But also I think we say this worked for me. And I say it worked in
Yeah.
spite of, not because of. Now I think another reason why incentives and punishments are so popular is because they do work pretty effectively in the short run.
Yes.
If I want, you put a gun to my head, and there's a lot of things that I'll do that I wouldn't otherwise do. You dangle millions of dollars in front of me, and who knows, what I might say or do. But what these things do is they focus us on ourselves and not on the community, and they also focus us on the here and now, and they really interrupt things like intrinsic motivation, the things that we really rely on to be successful. And so in so many ways, I can see why we continue to embrace it, and we unwittingly are undermining the very things that we want to be able to engender in our kids. Because the other thing that incentives and punishments do is that they shut down our brain. When we're focused just on what's in front of me now, I become a very different kind of thinker. When I'm afraid that punishments work because of shame and fear,
Mm.
and we know that shame and fear shuts down the parts of our brain that are we need for learning, that we need for thinking broadly, that we need for our social ability to connect with other people. And so we're shutting those parts of our children's brains down when we most want those to be opened up.
I want to dig in more. You actually preempted one of the questions I
Oh,
had.
okay. Sorry about
No, it's
that.
good. No, it's good. It means yes,
Yeah.
we're connecting. Around this idea of incentives make me think self-centered, right? What's
Yeah.
in my best interest here? Right? Incentives and punishments both kind of trigger us to go that way. And you're suggesting we need to flip the way our children think too, to get them to elevate their thinking and think not just about me, if I can quote Spock, right? The
Yeah.
needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right?
Yeah.
But this
Yeah.
is a real shift. We've got, in today's world, it seems like a big ask to get people to stop thinking just about themselves and think about the broader community that they're part of. And I guess, and I'm rambling a little bit here because I don't even know how to ask this question, but how do you go from, do you have to have the community first in order to get them to have that attitude, or do you need to kind of shift the attitude in order to have that community? It's
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I think that if we shift some of the ways that we think about how to best support our kids, that community will then follow, and in a different kind of way. The some of the research on if we look at business, for instance, what will happen is when we create these incentive programs, then what we've also done is we've created situations where colleagues are going to compete against one another. And I used to want to be a coach. I'm not against competition in and of itself. But I guess what I would say is let's not orchestrate competition as if there's a zero-sum game. One person wins and another person loses. And so what the research really says about, especially for kids, is that they looked at hundreds of studies and they found that it undermines kids' mental health, it undermines their achievement, that undermines all aspects of their behavior if we surround them and if we rely on punishments to incentives and punishments to control their behavior. So what I would say is that let's take those things out if we don't need, because we don't need them, and let's see what happens. At the school where I was a principal, I remember being saying we had all these incentives. So if you did well and we had point sheets, and kids would have to achieve a certain level on their point sheet, and if they did, they'd get what was called, they'd move up a level, and then they'd get a level lunch,
uh,
right? And then you'd get something else, and you'd get extra computer time. And I remember saying, let's not do that anymore. Let's have them still track their progress because we want them to be able to track their progress. But what happens? Let's see what happens if we just take away the incentives. And kids and staff all said, no, that's no one will ever work for this stuff anymore. And that's not what happened. We began having different conversations, not about what do they want for lunch, but about what they did to be able to make it to that next level, about what they need to do to make it to the next level. And it's because it's that they were wanting this instead of wanting it because I get a soda at the end of the day, at the end of the week. I want it because it's better for me.
yeah.
And so then we begin, and it's better for my community. So as opposed to me constantly trying to focus on just what's in my best interest now.
Let's talk about assessment and grades. ABCD grading system. So for me, I see this as it can be either a reward or a punishment, right? So how does that thinking shift here in your model?
I think it fits really well. It makes everybody anxious, but the way we've learned has never been originally has never been based on grades. And my guess is that as you learn to become a better and better podcaster, if someone just came in and said, you got a C or you got a D on this one, that would change how you'd engage with it instead of saying, here's how you could frame the questions differently. Here's what gave you real feedback. And I guess the other thing that if there are concepts that we need to learn, then let's learn them. What good is knowing a concept to a criteria of D when if it's an important concept, then I should master it. If it's important enough to teach, then let's
Right.
figure out how do we master it. We would never say, "Oh, this pilot's takeoffs are all an A, but the landings are a D, but they're going to pass with a C plus." Right?
Yeah,
We would never do that. We'd
right.
say, no, master the landing before we put anybody else on a plane with you. And because that's important to learn. And so to me, I do think that grading can really disrupt things. Even as a graduate student, even now, if I took something that was graded and the teacher had all sorts of feedback, what would be the first thing I'd look for? The grade. First
Right.
thing I'd look for is
Yeah. A
what did I get
score.
on this?
Yeah.
Exactly. And if I got an A, I'd be less likely to look at the feedback. I'd be
Right.
like, I got an A. And if I got a D, I'd be upset about the feedback. And so I do think that grades can distort what we believe is learning. Back in the day when there were more apprentices, and that's how people learned. There was not this grade. There was this constant feedback about this is what you need to do to be able to master this so you can have your own shop.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a term that comes up quite a lot in my discussions, yes, on mastery
Yeah.
versus a grade. It just
Well,
says, yeah,
and mastery versus the idea of achievement. That mastery is about the learning, whereas achievement is about a goal. Mastery is about, I want to be the best violinist I can be. Achievement is, I want to be first chair. And
yes.
those are,
Yeah.
and ideally, the person who focuses on mastery will actually get to the first chair,
Right.
or be okay if they don't get to the first chair, right? But
Yes.
because
Yeah.
they're learning. I remember Pablo Casal. There's a nice quote. I think they asked him why he continued to practice at age 93, and he said, "I'm starting to notice some improvement." But it's about
Yeah.
this love of this. It's about, oh, this is important, and I'm engaged in this.
Yeah. I love Daniel Pink's book, Drive, right?
Yes.
It talks about
Yep.
intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And of course, one of his first, there is mastery, right?
Yes.
We want to be masters at something.
Yes.
Which brings me to another concept here too, and in education, I call it the pull versus the push. So
Hmm.
our education systems are generally based around a push. A teacher tells you you need to learn this, and then I'm going to test you to see that you demonstrated knowledge or mastery in
Yeah.
these concepts. It wasn't the student's decision to learn this. It was pushed on them by an educator. They didn't
Yeah.
decide what to learn. The pull, on the
Yeah.
other hand, is curiosity, right? It's the
Yeah.
student
I love
saying,
this. Yeah.
I want to learn this. I'm seeking knowledge, right? Now the learning becomes the motivator. I'm
Yeah.
expressing an interest in learning it versus in the push, the goal becomes the grade, right?
I think that's such an important distinction. And I hadn't heard about the push and pull, but I love that metaphor. And I guess I would extend that to what's happening with teachers now. You've got students who are really remarkably disengaged educationally. I think only 33% of high school students say that experience engagement.
Yeah,
The interesting thing is only 30% of teachers are described as highly engaged,
yeah.
and 17% are described as, or 13% are described as actively disengaged. I'm not sure what that means, but it's not good.
It doesn't sound
And
good. Yeah.
I think the same thing is happening though for teachers is they're being told this is what you need to teach, and we're going to measure you on student progress.
Yep.
And just as
On their
students are not
grades.
getting
They're getting
exactly,
measured by the
exactly.
same yardstick. Right.
Yep. And so we've taken the intrinsic piece out of this, and we've got 40% fewer people entering teacher education programs. We've got people leaving the profession in ways they never have. We've got a teacher shortage. And
Yeah.
so when is it that we begin to look and say, oh, there's some solutions to this, right? We need to empower people in a different way.
Yeah.
We need to engage them in a different way. We've got to give them more independence. We've got to have this be a greater sense of purpose other than I'm just a cog. The next teacher who came in here would teach the exact same scope and sequence. They would teach the exact same units at the exact same schedule. So why am
Yeah.
I here?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important that we look at the whole system and how we're taking away the this wonderful curiosity, this wonderful sense of purpose that a teacher teaches with and that students learn with, and how do we match those instead of how do we continue to say, this is what you're going to have to learn, this is how you're going to learn it. And even if your brain doesn't work that way, even if you're not interested, this is how we're going to do it.
Yeah. All right. We've gotten a little bit off, but this is great dialogue, and you're reinforcing some of the stuff that's certainly been in my head already from other conversations I've been having on the show. But let's get back to, I want to get back to this concept of a healthy community, because you make a point
Yeah.
that this is core to human development and wellness. How do you define a healthy community, and what's a teacher's role in creating that community?
Yeah, great question. There's a term called consilience, and that's when different areas of science and research come together and say the same thing.
Okay.
And I find this fascinating about what we need in order to be able to be our best selves and to develop as fully as we possibly can. And they all have the same basic pieces. And the one that really drove us at North Shore Academy is called the Circle of Courage, and it's a model for how do we build communities that support children's resilience and allow us to thrive. And there were three psychologists at Augustana College in South Dakota who worked together. One of them grew up in the Lakota tradition, and he said, "This is these are the same values that drove my growing up." And so they modeled this after the medicine wheel. But what they say is that what they found in their research is there are four basic universal human needs. This was a theory back in the early 80s, and then it became developed in practice as it became better. Schools and programs began to use it, and then brain science then began to share just how important these things are. So the four things are: you need to have a sense of belonging, that you're important, you matter in this community. The second is mastery, which we just talked about, this drive to get better at something that's meaningful for
Hmm.
us. The third is independence. And Dan Pink talks about these things, right? He talks about independence. Autonomy is
Yep.
another way that people often think about this. But the ability to set goals and achieve them and have what it takes to be able to do this more independently. And the fourth that they talk about is generosity, this belief that I've got gifts to give to the world and the opportunity and the
Mm.
experience of sharing those gifts with other people. Other theories. So for Dan Pink in his book, he talked about mastery, autonomy, and purpose.
Right.
And there are other models, self-determination model talks about relatedness, autonomy, purpose, and competence. But again, these are all the same themes, and when they dovetail this way, it tells me we're onto something.
Mm.
And so it doesn't matter which theme we have, but these are the core pieces of what it means to be in a community, is being able to experience those things. And when we don't, it's pretty remarkable. We often fall apart. We can get physically sick. We can get emotionally fall apart. We certainly perform below our potential. And so, in each of those, there's some complexity to each of those four pieces, but they're so essential to our ability to grow and develop. And so, it's our job, for me as adults, for kids, is how can we create these communities? And as a principal, how can I make sure that my staff are experiencing, that my staff are in a community of belonging, that they're constantly learning, and that there's mastery, that they've got independence, they're not feeling micromanaged, and how can I continue to reinforce the importance and purpose of their work and the generosity of choosing a career that's totally based on focusing on the development of other people.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've had so many experiences where I've read something and gone, oh, that's Dan Pink's theory, just
That's
slightly
right.
different
Yeah.
labels, or
Yep.
maybe they added a fourth component to it or whatever. But yes, I've seen a lot of overlap between these theories, but that core theme just continues to come out. And I like that kind of shift from purpose to generosity,
Yeah.
because I think it illustrates that purpose is not just for me. It's not just a goal for me.
That's right.
Purpose is a feeling that I'm contributing something to something beyond myself.
Exactly. Something
Yes.
broader that I'm impacting, that then I use all of these gifts and my ability to be independent to enrich the lives of all those around me. And then that's how a community can really become self-sustaining, is it
Yeah.
becomes about the us and not about the me.
Let's take a quick commercial break. This is my opportunity to plug the human intelligence movement, not a paid advertisement. I'm just a fan. So the mission of the human intelligence movement is to ensure that students have the skills to thrive and succeed in an AI world. This is so important. So I've got a link in the show notes. Please, check them out. Join the movement. Let's do this. Now back to my conversation with Doug Bolton. So we're going to dig a little deeper now into the importance of healthy communities, healthy attachments, and the teacher's role in changing the way we build relationships, with and between students right in the classroom.
But going back to the kind of the second part of that, teachers, how do
Yeah.
teachers in a classroom, so something they can control, right? How do they do this in their little world? They can't control everything else that's happening for a student, but what can they do in their classroom to help build a healthy community?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things. If we just take a look at belonging, one of the things that I say is now that there's this focus on achievement test scores and all of the accountability that we have, that we typically now teach, there's this pride in teaching bell to bell. And what ends up happening when we teach bell to bell is the first thing to go is the time to connect with one another. It's so focused on content, it's not focused on the other.
Yeah.
And yet learning has always been social. And when we are connected in relationship, it makes our brains come alive in whole different ways. There's a Bruce Perry, who's a remarkable neuroscientist, especially with as it relates to trauma. He's been a leading voice. And what he says is in order to access our best brains, in order to access reason, we need to be connected in relationship and we need to be emotionally regulated. And so what I would say is how can we embed both of those things into our classrooms? How can
Hmm.
we make sure that when kids walk in that we've got a minute to just catch our breath, to quiet that nervous system of ours? How can we make sure that my thing would be, can every student know something different about one other person by the end of class? Like
Okay.
just, and it could be, and I think it can be content related. How did this story relate to your own life? Find someone you haven't talked to this week and share that. So there are simple ways that we can get at belonging. The second piece that I think is important, the mastery piece, is how can we've already talked a little bit about how we can grade differently, right? But the idea, I think, for mastery is how can we spark curiosity? And you had mentioned curiosity earlier, and
Hmm.
one of the things that I've been fascinated by is the use of AI to help us with this. The difference between a learning goal, which may be we're going to learn today about global trade in the 1800s,
Yeah.
and that's people's eyes are going to glass over. Or in biology, we're going to learn about the different parts of the mitochondria. But if you could start, what the brain wants is this gap. They call it a curiosity gap or knowledge gap between what I know and being teased with something. So that's all of these teasers on the
Yeah.
internet
Yeah.
create this. So can we create that with kids? We're going to learn today about the part of the cell that allows you that helps people, that is essential for people to dunk a basketball. That would
Okay.
be the mitochondria. Let's talk about there's one spice that completely changed the course of the international trade in the 1800s. Like, how can we create that? They may not be interested in biology in general, but can we create an interest in this moment that they want to master what's happening so that now I understand how the mitochondria is what creates the energy that allows us
Yeah.
to dunk a basketball.
Sorry, I
The
want to
third is,
inject
yeah, go
something
ahead.
there because just it triggered another thought that I've had. We've had multiple conversations about this too. The difference between getting them curious about something that's known, right? So in your case, the pepper was the answer, right? So the teacher
Right.
knows the answer versus curiosity about something where you can put it out there and even the teacher is saying, I don't know what the best answer to this is, right? Or the right answer. There may not be a right answer. And so you're challenging the students to go find an answer, and then we'll compare answers and debate who came up with the best answer to this.
I
I,
love
I
that.
love those challenges in a classroom as well.
And that fits in the independence piece, doesn't it?
The autonomy
Because
piece, yes,
because
yeah.
yeah, but because what we're saying is we trust you to explore this. And we're going to give you the support you need to be able to come up with your answer to this problem. And this is why I love problem-based learning
Yeah.
is a similar focus, is we trust you with your own learning. And when you trust kids, it's amazing how they show up for you.
Yeah.
It's when it's, but we so often don't trust kids to be able to do it. And then we script it all, and then they check out because
Yeah.
who wants to be scripted that way? And this gets at the real challenge that we've got with kids with this idea that when we focus so much on content and delivery of content, and that there are right answers and wrong answers, and there are winners and losers, and the winners are the ones who really, it's a test of compliance as much
Mm.
as it is anything. Can you comply, and do you have the executive functioning to be able to put in the work and organize that work in a way that allows you to get to this outcome, right, which is
Yeah.
an A as I grade it. But what happens is that the kids who end up being the very best at that, number one, is they begin to define themselves based on their achievement, not based on their engagement.
Yeah.
But number two, they end up being experts in being able to comply. And I heard Tony Wagner, the educator Tony Wagner, in a podcast or an interview or something just this week, saying in the innovation economy, those skills fall really flat. In the classroom that you're describing, those are the kids who are going to thrive in this place where Google and AI will give you all the answers to the content that you're looking for. What we need are people who think broadly, who feel trusted to go off and on a different tangent here and figure out how do I understand this in a different way and then be able to communicate it back without all of these rules that we put in place.
Yeah.
So I really agree with you. I love that concept.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. All right, I got another one. You're going to like this one. You talk about insecure attachment and healthy
Yeah.
attachment,
Yeah.
okay? And these have lifelong kind of consequences, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
how insecure or healthy we are in our attachment. So, can you describe this a little bit? What does that mean? Insecure attachment and healthy attachment.
Yeah, there are a couple of people who really did a lot of this research way back in the early 1900s, and then the research has just continued to pile on. So began with John Bowlby, who really was the father of attachment theory, and what he said is that our very earliest connections with especially with caregivers, create a template essentially for how I can expect relationships to happen in the future. And if those relationships are fraught or there's some sort of loss or distance or fear associated with them, then it shifts how I see the world as I continue to develop because I begin to experience the world through that lens. There's a woman, Margaret Ainsworth, who did some remarkable. I don't think it was Margaret. It's Ainsworth. I can't remember the first name. But she did this thing called the strange situation experiment, and it's anything but strange if you've had younger kids. It's really dropping your kid off at daycare, and
Oh,
how do they
okay.
respond to that?
Yeah. I
And
remember this story in the book. Yes.
yeah, and so what she did was she had people walk in with with their 1 year old, and there was a research assistant there and some toys. And they had people behind kind of coding and watching these interactions. And so then they saw whether the child went and interacted with the other person, whether they felt comfortable playing, or whether it was a strange situation and they sat on mom's lap and was clingy. And then they had the mom leave and they observed what happened with the child. And then they had the mom come back and saw the reunion. And what they did was they identified four different kinds of attachment. Insecure attachment. There was a secure attachment and insecure attachment. And what they found is that there were some kids who would be distressed when their parent left, but were okay and they could be soothed and maybe interact with the
Yeah.
other person that was there, or go back to playing. And then when mom comes back, there's a reunion and then go back. But there were a lot of kids who completely fell apart. And those kids were kids who mom would come back and they'd become incredibly angry, kids who didn't seem to notice whether mom was there or not. So there were all sorts of these different ways that kids responded. But the kids who responded in the healthiest way, about 70% of those kids responded in a way that was pretty appropriate.
Yeah.
And they were not overly distressed and it didn't disrupt their functioning. But there were 30% of the kids where it did. The interesting thing is they began to follow those kids, and they followed them into elementary school where they really began to struggle. They were more defiant. They struggled academically in pretty profound ways. They might be more clingy than other people. They were described as much less mature. They followed them into high school, and those kids, in a similar way, struggled with anxiety and depression and defiant kinds of behaviors. And then I also talk about this study in a book where the grant study where they looked at hundreds of people starting in their late teens, early 20s in Boston. Some of them at Harvard, some of them from the city generally, and then they followed those folks for years. They took all sorts of history, but they followed them. They're still following them. And this is 80 years later. These
Hmm.
guys are over 100 years old and they're still following them. And what they wanted to do was to say, what is it that creates health and success? And what they found was there's one main thing, and that is our relationships. They were able to identify which people were struggling in their relationships, who had insecure attachment.
Mm.
And then they followed those people, and they were significantly less likely to live into their 80s. They made half of the money, the salary that the people who were securely attached made. They were 10 times more likely to suffer from a chronic illness. They were
Wow.
5 times more likely to have a mental illness, 3 times more likely to have an addiction problem. And so all of a sudden, it's not just about, oh, we need to have relationships so we can feel good. This security in our relationships with other people is a huge determinant on our physical health, our mental health, and our ability to be successful in work and in marriage and in life. And so when we talk about these things, as I tell in the story, I think I was pretty securely attached. And then my life fell apart after my parents got divorced. And I think I became less securely attached after that point in time. So, this secure and insecure attachment isn't like a life sentence. We can always, through healthy relationships, we can rewrite those attachment stories. But we need to be able to have adults who are able to stick with kids who struggle with attachment. Because when you struggle with attachment, you may be more rejecting to other people. You may be more clingy in ways that put people off. You may be more aloof and not interested. And it takes the adults to continue to work to connect in order to repair any of those challenges of insecure attachment.
So I just want to echo back. So part of what I
Yeah,
heard there was that this can develop very young, even by 1 year old, right? We can
yeah,
be showing evidence of insecure or secure attachment, but
yeah,
it can be repaired, right?
yeah,
That even if parents, for whatever reason, weren't able to give a child what they individually needed to have secure attachment or healthy attachment, then later in life, we can still fix that. Which brings me to my next question here about
yeah,
teachers. Okay.
yeah.
Are we at a place here now where you're proposing that teachers need to become more like psychologists? So less emphasis on knowledge transfer and more emphasis on behavioral, psychological, emotional therapy and counseling. Is the role of teacher changing or needs to change?
I don't think I would describe it that way. Because I think that would be asking too much of teachers, and I don't think the kids need that. But
Okay.
what I do think is the reason why teachers go into the profession, every teacher that I've talked to has said, because I care about kids. And we all have our different ways of connecting, and we all have our different ways of showing people we care about them. And what we want to do is create, and it doesn't have to just be the teacher, but can we create classroom communities where we know one another, where we have a sense of belonging? And
Mm.
we've all experienced that in our lives. It doesn't take a psychologist or any information in behavioral health to be able to think back. If I ask people, think back to a time where you were part of a community where you thrived. I would bet that they weren't saying it was led by a psychologist. No, they would say it was led by a coach. It was a youth group. I was on a team in a school where we really worked really well together as educators. That's when we thrive. So I don't think that it does take that, but I guess what we do need to do is rethink the classroom community generally.
Yeah.
Because when kids feel like they're connected, it doesn't get in the way of instruction. It actually enhances their ability to access instruction. It's essential for them to access instruction.
Hmm.
And to me, this is something that we all should be doing anyways. The when people talk about their favorite teacher, they often would not say they were a complete jerk and they frightened everybody, but they got the best grades. No, they would say, no, they cared about me as a person. They challenged me in ways that I didn't think I could be challenged. And again, to be challenged requires them to know something about me. If I'm a student, in order to challenge me, you need to know something about me. I need to trust you to be able to, for me to take on that challenge. And so these things are happening. So I think it's getting back to the core of what it means to be an educator, not to go above and beyond what it means to be an educator.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Let's end with some optimism.
Yeah.
Tell me where you're making a difference. Where is this coming to fruition? What are you seeing out there?
The thing that I love is that I go and I share this message with people, and they continue to want me to come back. And so
Okay.
much of my work now is working in schools. And I think that there are a lot of people who say, as educators, they feel seen in a way that they hadn't felt seen before. That they'll often say, "This was me." And as they read my book, it's like you were talking to me.
Mm.
So these ideas have resonance. And I guess the other piece is that it doesn't require doing more. In fact, it in so many ways it requires us to do less. And taking in our schools, we've got students who are more stressed than ever, and teachers who are more stressed than ever, and parents who are more stressed than ever. And
Yeah.
I think it's about doing less, not more. And that's an easier solution than trying to figure out, okay, how do I understand this behavioral treatment so that I can support my child who's stressed? No, it's about how can we slow everything down? How can we focus more on the relationship, which is what we've always done to be successful as a
Mm.
species. So, anyways, that's what makes me hopeful and excited about the work that we're doing, and to be in conversations like this with you, Eric. It's just been I'm really grateful for the time that we spend and the thoughtful questions that you've been asking.
Oh, good. This has been a blast for me. As always, I love doing this show because I get to talk to interesting, really smart people like you. I hope that this is an ongoing
I
relationship
hope so
too,
too.
right? That
Yes,
we
I'd love
stay in
that.
touch here, and I hope to see your work continue to scale and have broader impact. And maybe my platform here helps do that a little bit. That would bring me great joy.
Thanks so much, Eric. I really
Yeah.
appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and to share these ideas and with you and your audience.
All right, that was so much fun and insightful. I like Doug. I'm fascinated by his concept here of healthy communities, and these micro communities as places of belonging and acceptance within a classroom. So it really makes sense to me. And I love that Doug clarified that, what he's suggesting, it actually means teachers need to do less, not more. So we give the students autonomy to drive their own learning so teachers can do what they love, right? Working with the students and encouraging them to explore, their own interests and, the things they want to learn about. So his book, Untethered, it's just a must read. We barely scratched the surface of the discussions that he has in there and the really, really practical tips that he has. Please look for that. I've got a link in the show notes. I hope you'll read it and then engage with me in a discussion about what you think of his practical advice for teachers and parents and students. I'm Eric Byron. Thanks for listening to the Education Innovators podcast. Thanks to all those innovators out there. Keep doing what you're doing. You are making a difference.